Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and it's bath time. Now, making a bathtub out of clay is a decidedly more tasking task than I had anticipated, since getting a good bathtub shape is a bit of a ball ache. Getting the clay to keep the initial shape can be damn near impossible without a mold, so I'm gonna make one using foam. Or I guess it would be called a form, since I think a mold is something you put stuff inside, while a form is something you use to form stuff around. I think. I don't actually know, and I can't be bothered to look it up since I'd rather just use whatever terminology feels right in the moment. Since I don't think you should let syntax prevent you from using whatever word you want. For instance, I don't think syntax is the right word there either, but it's a great word, and I don't think it gets used enough. Regardless, at this point I've built a pretty wonky looking foam form for my bathtub. Of course, I can't put the foam in the oven while the clay cures, since that would significantly increase my chances of getting lung cancer, so I'm going to use some of this sculpting mesh to help the clay keep its shape while it's baking. Once I've got it formed around my form, I can cut the excess away, then finally get to the clay bit. I'm going to use Super Sculpey for the tub since it's extra firm once it's been baked and it's really easy to sand, which should give me a nice smooth finish. All I need to do then is smoosh it flat and start forming it around the mesh form that's formed from the foam form. This is the first layer of the tub, so I'm not concerned about it being smooth, as I'm going to be adding more layers as I go, and this is really just the first attempt at getting a sorta tub-like lump of clay. The foam can then get removed, and I'm ready for the initial curing. Now that I've got a nice hard shell, I can start to add the external layers by building up the overlapping thin sheets of clay until I've got both the inside and the outside of the tub covered. I'm going to be a bit more focused on removing any big lumps or seams at this point, since any extra time spent smoothing the clay while it's soft will help reduce the amount of time I need to spend sanding later. Eventually though, I will get bored of doing this, and I figured future Adam can deal with today Adam's laziness. Then it's into the oven to bake, and I'm left with a lovely, albeit lumpy bathtub, ready for some sanding. After just a touch of sanding, I've got a smooth enough tub in need of a curved lip. I'll make this by wrapping an extra long wormy dealie around the rim and smoothing it into the rest of the tub before pinching and pressing it down to create the rounded top lip. This then gets a quick sanding to smooth it out, and with that I've now got a pretty perfect little cast iron but actually clay bathtub, which means it's time to make Terry. Now Terry is something of a recurring character on this channel, since he really encapsulates the values I think this channel's been built on. He's got an oversized head that doesn't really fit his body. He's a weird amalgamation of two things that shouldn't be, but somehow he's both unsettling and lovable at the same time, and of course being an octoskull, he's got 8 big tentacly arms which, once you get right down to it, are really just over-engineered wormy dealies. Now, if you're new to the channel and you don't know who Terry is an octoskull who first appeared over a year ago as the lonely denizen of a swimming pool, and that was really it. So when I say recurring, I mean, like, once before. Anyways, as Terry's a skull but also an octopus, the obvious starting point would be making a skull, which I've made to be a mostly accurate human skull, since I know that octopus have skulls. Do octopus have skulls? It has no skeletal structure, but does possess a skull. See, I knew that already. But having never seen one, I can only assume it would be the same as mine. So then once the clay's been baked, I can start to cut the cranial sutures into the skull, which will be the final detail since Terry doesn't have teeth or a bottom jaw. Instead, he's just got a bunch of wormy limbs. These wormy limbs start out as little balls of clay that get rolled into tapered noodles that get surface textured via nitrile gloves. Nitrile gloves are a favorite of mine since the grippy tips impart a barely there but definitely still there dotted surface texture to whatever they touch and helps to make an otherwise unnaturally smooth surface look a little bit more real. Terry's wormy limbs get a smaller set of wormy dealies attached to the sides to create a more tentacly look, then I'll run my ball stylus back and forth across the top to give the tentacles a bit more pronounced texture. Now, I know that an octopus's limbs are called arms, but like I said at the start of the video, I like to use terminology that's more fun, and tentacle is a lot more fun than arm, so I'm going to keep calling them that. Otherwise, a couple different tools will add some more texture, and the top side is finished, so I can flip the tentacle over and start to add some simple texture to the underside before adding lots of little balls that then get poked in the center to create a plethora of suckers. And with that, Terry's tentacle's finished, which means I just need to do that 7 more times. Otherwise, with my octuplets finished, I can start to stick them to Terry's skull. There's no real trick with this. As long as the first one lines up nicely with his nose hole, I can just stick the rest in place, then blend them into the skull, so I'm left with a nice wobbly-limbed octo skull ready for his bath. Once I've popped Terry into his tub, I can gently reposition the limbs so they're a bit more dynamic. However, I don't want to press the soft clay into the cured clay too much, since I want to be able to remove him to paint afterwards. Otherwise, once I've got the position I'm looking for, it's into the oven for a final bake to lock Terry and his tentacles in place. Since I was plenty gentle pressing his limbs into position, it's easy enough to remove Terry from the tub so that I can set him aside and add the claw feet to my claw foot tub. I didn't want to add these earlier since they'd be too soft and weak while baking, and with Terry's weight inside the tub, they definitely break during the bake. Now that I'm done with everything else though, it's safe to add the feet, give it a final bake, then pop Terry back into his tub so I can add a nice white primer to both Terry and his beloved clawfoot tub. As for painting, the tub is already a nice porcelain white, so all it needs is some serious weathering, which I'll do by applying a heavy coat of rust pigment using a sponge. I'll start with a darker brown rust and give the majority of the tub a spongy once over, then come back with a lighter coppery looking rust to add a bit of color variation before tickling the entire bathtub body with a dusting of dusty rust colored pigment powders. The feet will get a silver top coat, and while silver doesn't rust, it does tarnish, which I'll do by applying a heavy black wash over top. Finally, since I'll be filling my tub with resin and there's a lot of dry pigment powder on the surface, I'll give the tub a coat of low gloss varnish to seal and protect the surface. With that, the tub is finished, so I can get started on Terry. Now, Terry's skull's a bit too white, so I'll tone that down with some thick bone white washes to add some wonky discoloration before painting all his tentacles with a dark purple base coat. I'll give the underside an initial pale flesh tone base coat followed by a very thin pink wash over top before highlighting each of the suckers with a simple light white once over. Back to the tops of the tentacles, I'll give them a series of progressively lighter purples and pinks until I've got a slightly ragged blend from the darker outer tones to the lighter center tone, which is nearly white. A bit of sponge work with some lighter bone whites and whites will clean up Terry's skull while I wait for the tentacles to fully dry. Once they're done, I can top coat them with a dark purple glaze to bring back all the textures and details. I wanted to give Terry some ominous eyeballs, so I'll squish some purple clay into the eye sockets and roll my stylus around a bit before popping some pre-baked black balls into the center. The clay won't cure, but unless I start stabbing his eyes with the toothpick, they should be fine. Last but not least, a little UV resin to make them shiny and gross, and I can do a quick dry fit to make sure everything is looking good. And since I'm pretty happy with this, I can take Terry back out and get to making my bath water. Terry's bathwater is made out of a simple 2-part epoxy resin that I'll mix up and tint blue before deciding it ought to be dirty water, so I'll add some brown, then pour this into the tub. Now with a tub full of water and no visible leaks, I can fit Terry into the nasty water-filled tub and give it 48 hours to cure. Once it's fully cured, I'll use a bit of UV resin on the top to add some simple ripples, and that's Terry and his tub finished, which means it's time to make a dilapidated bathroom. I want my floor to be made of wooden boards, but I need something to attach them to that won't be noticeable, so I'll start by painting this piece of MDF black. The floorboards themselves will be made up a bunch of tongue depressors, however the tips are rounded, so I'll need to flick them flat. Then I can apply a whole bunch of glue to my base until it's fully covered so I can start to lay my flooring down. I'd also like to point out that I didn't measure this at all, and it's through sheer coincidence that this leftover MDF sheet is exactly 12 tongue depressors wide. Once the glue's dried, I can flip the board over so that I can trim the overhang to length before applying a darker brown wash to bring out the grain, before then deciding that a proper bathroom wouldn't have a stained floor, it would have a painted floor instead, so I'll repaint it with a thick coat of black paint. I'm also not going to thin my paint at all since I want it to sit on top and I don't want it to leach into the wood, as I'm going to sand a fair amount of it away to give me a nice worn, well-used look. Finally, to help blend the lighter shade of the exposed wood underneath, I'll give it a couple coats of brownish grayish wash, then set it aside to dry while I get started on the walls. My original plan was to make tiled walls out of foam, but I figured there's enough talented people making tiled bathroom dioramas, so maybe it's time to try something a bit different. These are some leftover pieces of an IKEA shelf that I smashed into little pieces, and with a bit more smashing, I can make myself some tiny nerdy wall studs. Now, while my studs are appropriately wonky, they're a bit oddly sized, so I'll trim the ends until I've got a uniform length. Then I can take my wonky but equally long studs and start to assemble my wall. Now, instead of tiled walls, I thought maybe I could make them plaster and have them all smashed up. And if I'm going to be making a plaster wall, then I kinda need to make the lath underneath so the plaster has something to hold on to. I'll make the lath out of the ever-useful stir sticks, which I'll then glue lengthwise across the wall, focusing mostly on the bottom since that'll be where they're most visible through the cracks. However, I'm going to make sure to add some to the top as well to help keep the plaster flat. And then once the glue is dried, I can then snip the overhangs off. Then the whole thing gets a heavy coating of dirty brown wash to make it look like a gross, aged wall that's been hiding in a dilapidated, abandoned building for years. I'll then follow this up with a cheap and cheerful beige dry brush to add some color variation, then I can repeat these steps to make another wall. And to make my plaster walls, I'm gonna use plaster. It'd be damn near impossible to get the actual plaster onto these walls without it being a total nightmare, so I've made a couple frames that are the exact same size as my walls. I can then pour the watery plaster into the frames and leave it to cure. Once it's dry, all I need to do is pop the plaster out of the frame. Now, plaster doesn't adhere to foam very well, so if you're careful and you take your time, you should be able to remove the walls without too many cracks. Even if they do get cracked though, it doesn't really matter since I'm going to be breaking the walls anyways. Once I've removed my plaster from the frame and assembled my puzzle pieces, I need to attach the walls to the studs. To do this, I've mixed up some Mod Podge and hole filler, which makes a sticky, white plaster-like glue that will help the two pieces adhere. For the first wall, I applied it onto the wood before realizing it's a hell of a lot easier just to smear it onto the plaster and press the wall into place. It also leaves some pretty terrific squeeze-through that looks plenty authentic. If I were ever to do this again though, I think the best thing to do would be to press the wooden wall into the still wet plaster while it's in the frame. Something, hindsight's 20/20. My first thought was to paint the walls purple before realizing terry is purple, so instead I'll give them a coat of kinda gross old-timey green. Then while the paint is mostly cured but still slightly damp, I'll try and rub it off so it makes it look like the paint is peeled and flaked off. Some kind of masking solution would have been perfect, but I don't have any, so this'll have to do. Using some heavier sculpting tools, I'll encourage the plaster to break and fall away, then I can scrape the remaining plaster off the wood with some sharper chisels. Any of the larger pieces that have fallen off accidentally can be reattached using a little PVA glue, then I can start to do the same thing to the other wall. I knew I wanted the lath to be showing through on the bottom, so I'll cut away a big section of the plaster to expose the wood underneath, then it's just a case of smacking and rubbing and attacking what's left till my walls look extra well used. We'll then cut away a strip on the bottom of both walls so that the bottom can sit flush with the wooden flooring, as well as a strip on the side of the smaller wall which will allow me to more easily glue the two walls together. The floor can then be glued into place and I can start weathering using this spray bottle filled with muddy brown wash. I'll give both the walls and the floor a good soaking, then using a cotton bud I'll drag the dirty wash downwards to create some streak marks and remove any of the buildup around the overhangs. I save some little chunks of broken painted plaster which I can scatter around the floor, then hold in place with some thinned out PVA glue. And while the glue is drying, I can get to work making the rod for the curtain. To make the metal shower rod, I'll take a length of armature wire, cut it roughly the right size, then spin it in my drill to make it nice and straight. Using a mug, I can give the wire a nice clean 90-degree bend, which will fit perfectly in my bathroom. All I need to do then is drill a couple holes and I can slide the rod in place and get started making my shower curtain. This is a sheet of cling film that I often use to cover my sculptures while I poke texture into it, so it's already kinda oily and gross. I want to see if I can paint it white though, so I'm gonna tape it to a big piece of cardstock and use my airbrush to apply a very thin layer of primer over the top. Hopefully the primer adheres to the plastic while remaining at least somewhat translucent. Also, maybe painting a clear plastic white on white background was a poor choice. My initial touch tests seem to be positive, so I can cut the sheet to the right size. Once it's removed from the tape, it's still super pliable and none of the primer is flaking off, and honestly, this is even better than I could have ever hoped for. To attach my curtain to the rod though, I need to make some of those little curtain hook things, which I'll make by wrapping a length of thin gauge armature wire around a little dowel and pressing it tight. Then by cutting them straight along the length, I can make myself a bunch of itty bitty metal rings. Back to the curtain, I'll lay it flat, then using a ruler to mark out equidistant spots, I can knock out a bunch of tiny circles. Then all I need to do is pry my little rings apart, fit them onto the curtain holes, and press them back together. Repeat this until all the holes are done and I've got a lovely little white curtain ready to be hung. I've made the wall anchors and the shower head off camera, but they're really just a bunch of circles on circles with holes poked into them that get glued together and attached to another length of wire, then bent into shape. Then they get painted with a shiny chrome top coat and I can fit them into place. The curtain's a bit too shiny and new, so I'll take my scissors to them to rip and tear them to shreds, then I can use my spray bottle of dirty brown wash to stain and gross them up real good. Finally, the shiny metal bits need a bit of aging as well, so I'll use that same rust from the bathtub to give the shower head and curtain rod some rust and ruin too. Then I can fit Terry and his tub in place, pull the curtain to give him some privacy, and well, that's us done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, just a big ol' thank you to my delightful patrons and a special shout out to my newest patrons, Matilda Castro Real, Miss Pizuzu, TJ, Tommy Solomons, Catherine Ball, Leia Elizabeth 89, Nato Sikarulids, Lucas G, Charlie Marino, Pancake JA, Aaron Father, Runaway Milky Way, Mike Borg, Woodcock Pocket, Dawid Bikzuk, Oliver Vitsgard, Aldi Paolo, Girl Scout Kookie, and Alexander and Grayson. You are the rusty bathtub that contains the tentacled monstrosity that is this channel. According to my YouTube data, 99.9% of you are already subscribed and only one of you isn't, so damn it Dave, stop being such a turd. Otherwise we'll see you next time. Cheers.